there's something very wonderful about the parables. And that is, you hear them at one time in your life, and they speak to you in a certain way, and then you listen to them a number of days, weeks, months, years later, and they speak to you then in a different way. And this continual re-evolving of the message that seems to come from the parables, I think, is what makes them so remarkable and so incredible. So we're going to dive into one of the parables today. And what's really interesting about this parable is that, first of all, we don't know it very well. And secondly, almost every commentator that you read on this parable will say, this is the most difficult parable of all. So, here we go. Let's see what's in this parable. In a second, I'll get some volunteers. No worries, no dress up, just placeholders. But I want to,
This?
Right. Oh, yeah, this is important. I forgot about this. Okay, so before we get into this parable, I want to show you this video clip. It's a little crass, and I've done my best to edit it out, and believe me, I took out a lot. But this is a public service announcement for organ donation. Watch it, and I'll tie back into it right at the end of the sermon. So here we go.
This is a story about Coleman Sweeney. Coleman, in short, was an asshole. Everyone in his small town knew it. It wasn't that he tried particularly hard to be unpleasant. It just seemed to come naturally to him. Coleman felt like the whole world owed him something, which caused him to regularly ignore the rules of a decent, acceptable society.
Wow. Really?
And he hated anything that got in his way.
Go, you got it! You got it, go! Go, go, you can do it!
And small animals. Even to children, he was an asshole. He was, as they say, born to it. But then, the strangest thing happened.
$3.
Something entirely unexpected. Coleman Sweeney died. A brain aneurysm. Well, subarachnoid hemorrhage to be more specific. And it came as he argued over whether extra fries should be included in a $1.99 early bird breakfast, which was a typical Coleman Sweeney play. It was then that Sarah found something completely unexpected. Coleman Sweeney had registered to be an organ donor. Nobody knew what caused Coleman to do it, but there it was, generous and majestic. And that was the day that Coleman went from asshole to hero. You see, his liver went to Stan, a father of two. His heart went to Miranda Morgan, who went on to teach for 25 more years. And his tendons went to Staff Sergeant Donahue, who was able to walk again and would never need to be pushed across the street by his physical therapist. And in a moment of small world irony, his corneas went to his 82-year-old next-door neighbor so that she could finally see the crap that her dog made in the side yard and pick it up.
Sorry, I cut it off early for a reason. So okay, you think, okay, we think, oh, these like strange concepts in church, but I'll get back to them, I promise. So to the parable. First, I want to get to some context. If you were in kindergarten, you might have learned patterns. And to finish this pattern, A, B, B, right? Pretty simple. The same thing happens in literature. Suppose you might remember from English class in high school, A, B, C, B, A, right? As a structure for a poem, for example. The same context applies to parables. And the thing about parables is we often read them in an isolated context. We take them out and we forget that they're part of a bigger story. The parable for today is part of a pattern just like this one. So in this, think about last week. We had Dot. She was a woman who went looking for her coin. And she found the coin and celebrated. It was about somebody who had lost something and then went and found it. And then there was Ken, who graciously dressed up like a shepherd and went looking for his sheep. And it was a story about a shepherd who had lost something and then found it. And both of those stories are very short. They're only 3 verses or something in the Bible. And then there's the most beautiful parable. It's the story of the prodigal son. Right? It's a story of a son who goes to his father and says, "Father, I wish you were dead, essentially. I want my inheritance now." So he takes his inheritance and he goes and he squanders it on who knows what. Let your imagination run wild. We got wine, women, and song, as somebody also said in Bible study, yeah. He finds himself in a pig pen feeding the pigs, and he decides, in a rare moment where we get to see into the mind of one of the characters in the parable, we see him say, I wish I would rather be back in my father's house and be a servant there rather than feeding these pigs. So he crawls back to his father, and his father embraces him and welcomes him back into his home. So, lost coin, lost sheep, lost son, and now that missing part is the parable we have for today. Could it be that this parable is also about something that is lost being found? So with that, we'll dive into it. Can I have a volunteer? Just somebody who can sit in a chair. Ty, come on up. Why don't you sit in the big chair there? So in this story, in our placeholder, Ty here is the master. You're sitting in the nicest chair, the fanciest one. You have lots of money and lots of power. You got it. Now, there's something you need to know about masters in the time. See, when we have a parable, we often like to say, well, the master, of course, that's God. But here's the thing about masters. Masters could be nice and friendly, and masters could also be downright mean and nasty. You'll need to decide for yourself whether the master in this story is one of the good ones or one of the bad ones. See, here's the thing about masters. They had a lot of power and a lot of money because most of the time they got it by oppressing the people below them. They would charge high interest loans to people, and when they couldn't pay it back, they would take the land, and they would have these big empires of land that they would use. The CBC just had a story this week about CEOs who make 159 times what the average worker does. It's that kind of discrepancy. So in our story, Ty is the master here. Now, masters would almost always have managers. Anyone, another volunteer? Keely, come on up. So in this story, Keely is the middleman or middlewoman. And what she would do is control all of the master's affairs. You see, the master has a lot of land and a lot of money and needs a big staff to manage it all, and Keely is just one example of that in the parable. Now, we don't know much about the manager in the story, but what we do know is how managers often operated. So the master would want their wealth used to create more wealth, and Keely was responsible for making that happen. So she would, let's say, take $1,000 from the master, take them and offer them to somebody else for an interest rate. Maybe 20%, maybe 30%, who knows? But here's the thing, the master would want a certain percentage on the return, let's say 20% for the sake of argument. And Keely would offer it to the person for 30%. And that extra 10%, who would it go to? Keely. It was good business, right? You take somebody else's money, you work for it, and then you get a little bit extra on the top, or a lot extra. And so managers turned out to be quite wealthy over time. Now, this relationship works well as long as everyone trusts the other person. But in our story for today, charges are brought from Ty against Keely. Ty thinks that something is off, that Keely is actually mismanaging her wealth. And so Ty says, Keely, you're going to be out of a job. Now, there's something about charges. Charges are very powerful. First of all, because whether a charge is true or not, it has power to create or destroy reputations. So if, for example, I was charged with running around Chemainus with a can of spray paint and defacing all the murals, my reputation would be quickly shattered. Not the cool guy, absolutely. Definitely not the cool guy in Chemainus. But if somebody else was found guilty of that, and I was let off the hook, how long do you think it would take to repair my reputation? A long time. So whether or not charges are true, they can actually have disruptive effects. But the other thing about charges is sometimes they pull out the real character of people. And in the case of the manager, we have another glimpse into the mind of this manager. And where has that just happened? Oh, right, in the story of the prodigal son. So imagine a little thought bubble above Keely's head, and this thought bubble says, you know, if I get kicked out, my reputation is going to be ruined. And if my reputation is ruined, well, I'm going to be left doing some sort of job that I really don't want to do. In this manager's case, it's dig holes or beg for money. And so the manager has an idea. I know what I'm going to do. So I need another volunteer. Ken, great. So in this story, Ken is a merchant of olive oil. And Keely, the manager, goes to Ken and says, Ken, how much olive oil do you owe the master? And Ken says, well, I owe 100 jugs of olive oil. And Keely says, you know what, Ken? Make it 50. Now, if when you had a mortgage, some of you still do, you had a mortgage, the bank manager calls you in for a meeting and says, hey, I see your mortgage there. What if we just cut it in half? Would that be okay with you? You'd be like, yes, well, where do I sign? You'd be very happy. Please, thank you. So now, Ken is probably pretty happy about this. What do you think he thinks of the manager at this moment? He probably thinks the manager's pretty great. And what does he think of the master? He probably thinks that the master is good too, because remember, the manager is always acting on the master's behalf. So in this case, both of these two look very good for something that she did. Now, the question is, what would Ty think of this? Because now what she's owed has just been cut in half. You might be very unhappy. But there's another twist here that you need to know about. There was a problem with taking interest. You see, back in those Old Testament stories where they had all those laws and commandments about what kind of fabrics you could wear and whether you could eat meat with milk and Sabbath and the Ten Commandments, there's a few examples of interest that are kicked in. It's not just one, there's many of them. But this is one example. Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from them. And them, in this case, being people who are down on their luck. But fear your God and let them live with you. So there are some people who have wealth and money and for whatever good reason, good luck, have more than other people. Just because they have more doesn't mean they should be charging interest. But remember, both of these people have charged interest for Ken's loan. So when they're slashing that loan back to 50, what they're probably doing is they're actually saying, you're still going to pay us back, but you're actually not going to pay us back all the extra interest that we've charged for you. Like all that interest that you owe to the bank, let's call that off. Just pay back the principal. Now, if you were a reader of this in the first century, a hearer of this parable, you would have recognized that now Ken is just being charged back for the principal. And why 50%, or why 100% in this case? Well, oil can go rancid, and there can be problems with it. It's a high-risk investment. Now, imagine Ken was a wheat farmer, for example, and so Keely again would go to her and to him and say, how much wheat do you owe? And Ken would say, I owe 100 bushels of wheat. And Keely would say, slash that, make it 80. So for these two, imagine there's another person there who's actually a wheat person. For these two people who have their interests cut, they look favorably on this master. Thank you, volunteers, for your time. Now, here's the surprise ending to this parable. In this parable, the manager is commended. The manager is commended for the work. Now, when you see it played out, I feel like it's actually less controversial. Because think about it. Think how happy the master would be that all around town are people telling of his or her generosity in this case. Think how great that would be for the master. And think how smart the manager was. How shrewd the manager was for that decision. So is shrewdness a Christian value? The story ends, and his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are children of the light. Clearly, Jesus thinks that there's something about this manager that we should be emulating. In Bible study, there was a really interesting example that somebody brought up. There was a group of churches in an area of Alberta, and people would come to these churches looking for support and help, whether it was food to help them get through the week or money to pay their furnace bill or whatever it was. But then they realized that people were going around to every single church and asking for the same amount of money. And the churches thought, maybe some people are actually taking advantage of us. Not everyone, just some people. Maybe we need to do something about it. So they simply said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to put one church in charge of all the aid that we're going to give out. So anyone who wants it can go to the church. We'll happily offer it. We're just going to be smart about it. In Matthew, Jesus says, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. It's not a church mission statement you often see, but maybe we should incorporate it more. Like, let's be really smart about what we have and what we're going to do with it. So we have the parable, and in this case, Jesus debriefs the parable with his disciples. But in the debriefing of the parable, we actually find stuff that can maybe rub us the wrong way. The most problematic of this is this phrase right after. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, that they may welcome you into eternal homes. So if you have a whole bunch of money, ill-gotten gains, that you then pay people off to, who will then welcome you into their homes, that's commendable, according to Jesus. Now, I have no idea what to do with that. What do we do with that? That's confusing. That doesn't seem to make any sense for us. But I'll get back to this point in a second. Jesus then has some less controversial things to say. Be faithful with what you have. If you lent a child a car to go get milk from the grocery store because you needed it, and they came back with the right amount of change, you would think, great, next time they want it to go to the movies or whatever, I'll lend it to them. But if you give them $20 and the car to go to the grocery store, and they come back asking for more money and the car has a dent in it, you'd think, no. Next time you want to borrow it, no dice. And Jesus says something kind of that we can understand. It was the Simon Says lesson from today. You cannot serve both God and money. Try it. It doesn't work very well, I don't think. Remember that Coleman Sweeney guy, the guy who's stealing people's candy out of their bins as they walk around? He's using the wrong bathroom and smelling it up. All these things that we think, oh, it's terrible. But in the end, he is redeemed. He's redeemed by this powerful moment where he gives his very body for the well-being of other people. You see, I think we really like life to be black and white. We like somebody to be either good or bad. And if they're good, we'll treat them with respect. And if they're bad, well, we'll just kind of ignore them and pretend they don't exist. We like life to be simple. We like to be able to put people in categories and boxes. But what happens when those fall apart? When somebody like Coleman Sweeney, who we think is terrible, ends up doing something very generous. In this parable, the manager, who is, I can only imagine, a conniving, sneaky little man, not you, Keely. This conniving person who goes and takes advantage of all sorts of poor peasants is redeemed. And we, who sometimes do things that are terrible and awful to one another, find ourselves the recipients of great grace. It's uncomfortable because we think only the people who are good should have that grace. Only the people who have done well in this world should be given that kind of honor. But this grace is for anyone, for everyone who wants it. Thanks be to God.